every once in a while someone will send me an email and say, hey, you're using this term. I didn't see it in the handout. I'm not sure what it is. A term that I've been using a lot is pyramidal, which is basically pyramid-like, right? So it's just like saying a triangular composition, except pyramidal assumes that you're thinking in three-dimensionality. So that's the term there. And again, if I'm using a term that's just something I'm throwing around, you're like, wait a minute, I don't know what that is, and I'm too embarrassed to ask in front of the whole class, send me an email. Say, right around here you're talking about this, I don't know what it is. So on to this work. This is a work that, again, Sistine Chapel ceiling, true fresco type of painting on wet plaster. The scene of the fall and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, which is one of those subjects that you have to know pretty well here. So if you've never spent any time with Christian ideas, this is a big one. This is one that goes back to the Old Testament, and it's basically the explanation for why God sends his only son, Jesus Christ, to earth in the first place, and why Jesus has to die. So the idea behind this is fundamental. The way that this works, again, short version, and I'm not going to proselytize to you. I don't have any interest in that, and I hope that I never kind of offend anyone who's very Christian, but I'm also not going to treat this with as if this is the gospel, right? We want to treat these as Christian stories. So this is just the short version of this story. We saw God made man in his image and made woman in his image, although what does that mean, right? It didn't show up very well here. And then they send them to God sends them to the Garden of Eden, which, as far as I can tell, is like the world's best vacation spot, right? It's like Maui. You go there, there's fruit dripping from the trees. No one has to want for anything. Weather's always good. Hey, have fun in there, but here's the one rule. Don't eat out of that tree over there. That's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat out of that, right? So it's like put the two children in there, say, hey, have fun, do anything you want, and by the way, don't do this. And you can always guess what's going to happen, right? They look around, they're having fun for a while, and then they're like, hey, why can't we eat out of that tree? Short version of the story is that a serpent, which is a symbol that comes out of earlier earth religions, very, very strongly identified with fertility and fecundity and life cycles and so forth, gets chosen in this story to represent evil. And later on, of course, they'll associate this with Satan and the devil and so forth, but it's not necessarily that in the original story. And the serpent comes along and goes to Eve initially and says, hey, Eve, what if God put you here and said, don't eat out of that, but really he's testing you? I mean, this is the more complicated interpretation. What if he's testing you? What if he wants to see if you have free will? Maybe you should taste that. Maybe he wants you to. Maybe he wants to see if you're independent. All of these fairly rational arguments, along with just a whole bunch of temptation. And Eve eventually takes the apple and then tempts Adam with the apple as well. They both have eaten of the apple, and something very curious occurs. The first thing that they notice is that they don't have any clothes on. Now, that might be something that you're like, well, what did they think before? What's going on? The explanation of the Bible is that they're shameful about the fact that they don't have any clothes on, which means that there's something illicit about their bodies now. It's not just a matter of them running around naked like children would, where no one worries about kids running around naked, or at least they didn't used to, right? They're just kids. They don't know any better. At this point, something sexualized has come into this equation. Now, it's all innuendo, it's all metaphor in the Bible. It doesn't say it explicitly, but that's very clearly the case. And, of course, God finds out. And God's like, no, how dare you do this? And with the help of an archangel, Michael kicks them out of the Garden of Eden, where they are attended by two major punishments. Adam's punishment is he's going to have to work for the rest of his life instead of just picking fruit off trees, right? And Eve gets two of them. One is that her desires shall be his, which is usually interpreted as saying, you're the one who tempted in the first place, you can't be trusted, therefore he's kind of in charge of you. That's not literally what the Bible says, but that's how it was interpreted. And then number two, which always seemed to me to be like one of the strangest types of punishments you could pull out of this scenario, you're going to also have pain in childbirth. It's like, wow, where'd you get that one, God? Just like, bam, pain in childbirth. It makes it associated with sex, is the thing, right? Something sexual involved in this. And now remember, when they're placed in the Garden of Eden in the first place, God says, be fruitful and multiply. So whatever kind of sex is going on in there isn't just about procreation, which is one of the reasons that Christians have so much kind of, I don't know how to put this, circumscription around the question of what types of sexual activities are okay and which aren't okay and all of that stuff, right? Remember, Catholics, and I'm not saying if you're a Catholic that you probably or your parents ever practiced this, but by the strict rules of Catholicism, of course, sex should only occur with procreation in mind. So any kind of use of birth control, not okay, and so forth, right? So let's think of those things all together and then realize that when they get cast out of the Garden of Eden, along with these punishments, what happens is that from that point forward, every human being born into the world is born in with this little dark smudge on their record called original sin. And original sin, something that if you're born into the world with, has to be taken away somehow. Something has to get rid of that. And the something that eventually gets rid of that or mediates that is Christ being born, coming to earth, and then dying on the crucifix for our sins. When they say for our sins, what they really mean is that original sin gets taken away, and now it's up to you to accomplish a life that's in line with Christian practices so that you will be judged in the end of days as either good and go up to heaven in a blissful state, or evil and end up in, fiery hell for all eternity. Does anyone have any questions on that really kind of simple version of this story? Okay, so at this point I have to double down on something. Although the Bible doesn't literally say it's all about sexual activity or some kind of illicit sexual activity, it had been interpreted that way, this fallen Garden of Eden, since medieval times. It's a no-brainer. The whole idea of the temptation, the whole idea of the forbidden fruit. I mean, you've heard all of this innuendo before. It's not literally in the Bible, but it's the way that it was interpreted. So it is some kind of sexual fall, and artists had represented it that way as well. So I asked you before to take a quick look at this picture and notice some things about it. What stands out about it to you? And I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes here, a minute or so. Turn to your nearest couple of neighbors and share with them what you see, what stands out. Remember, this is a generic story that's been told literally thousands of times, and now Michelangelo gets a hold of it. He tells it in what we call a simultaneous narrative. On the left-hand side is the temptation, on the right-hand side is the expulsion, in his own particular way, emphasizing particular things, not showing other things, de-emphasizing other things. How is he telling this story? Turn to your neighbors and share your thoughts. Someone share just one thing with me, if you don't mind. One thing you noticed, way back.
Adam kind of overshadows Eve in the right side of the frame.
Okay, so Adam kind of overshadows Eve, you mean right here?
Yes.
And what do you mean by that specifically? Like he's bigger than her?
Like she's kind of painted, like you contrast it with the left side of the frame, she's kind of painted a darker shadow.
Okay, good. So we got a couple things going on. He's definitely emphasized over here, but he's also the one that has the majority of the light on his body where she's cast in shadow. And what does light mean at this point? What is light? It's good, it's God, it's something that can indicate in a painting which one is more spiritual, or in this case, which one is less to blame. She's more to blame, more cast in the shadow, crumpled up into a smaller kind of shape than he is. Once again, kind of emphasizing, who caused this more. And if we stay on that theme, like whose fault is this more, what's another way to say, oh, this is the way we're doubling down on it being woman's fault? Does anyone notice that our snake has a gender? Our snake has a gender. Our snake has breasts, right? Not usually the case with snakes, by the way. So pretty good indicator. You've got a symbol going on here. Woman tempts woman, right? The snake associated with women. As I said before, snakes in earlier earth religions that, for instance, deify celestial bodies, tend to be associated with ideas of fertility and fecundity as wonderful things because that's the world that these people live in. They need their crops to grow, they need their animals to propagate, they need to stave off child mortality, so they basically worship things that represent life cycles. And a snake is very closely associated with that for a number of reasons, one of which is it's phallic, another is that it has multiple babies, another is that it winds itself up into a spiral to keep warm, and spirals are one of the oldest symbols humans have ever made about the cyclicity of seasons and the cyclicity of life and death. Snakes were even used in order to both cure people. Their venom has been a curative for a long time, as well as, of course, kill people. And then finally, snakes shed their skin, so associated with the idea of rebirth, right? So it's a powerful symbol early on, very closely associated with some things that are a bit of bugaboos for Christians, sexuality. And that's why it's in here. That's why it's associated with the female body. It's a female giving the fruit to the female here. What kind of tree is that, by the way, for the arborists in the room? It's definitely not an apple tree, though, right? What do you think it is? It's a fig tree, right? So a fig tree, very prominent frankly, in Italy, but all over the Mediterranean world. If you've never seen a fig tree when it's going crazy, think like plum trees in our neck of the woods. When they're happy, they drop fruit all over the place. They're associated with fertility again. In, again, the Bible, it doesn't say what kind of tree it is, but Michelangelo, knowing something about these earlier religions in which fertility would have been key, probably picked a fig tree to include in here. So then we go on to this one, the most awkward thing in this entire painting, which I'm sure everyone has seen at this point, but no one is going to say out loud because they're not sure if they should. What about the way that he has composed Adam and Eve on the left-hand side of the painting? How many people are like, huh, right? Huh, that seems odd. And it's not as if Michelangelo, after spending years planning this whole thing out and painting it, was like, holy shit, I didn't realize I did that, right? This is all planned in advance. So if you're like, well, what the hell's going on here? It's on purpose. And the reason it's on purpose, of course, is that it's that sexual innuendo in here. And he needs to make this, I think, an illicit activity. It can't be something that results in procreation. So if you indicate oral sex, then that's something that the Catholics of the time would have been like, people probably do this, but it's not okay by the Bible, and that's a way for me to reference a type of sexual activity or temptation that's all about pleasure rather than procreation, which is illicit, not allowed, right? And that's a pretty good way to do it. You look there and you're like, oh, something's going on. I get it. I get what's going on here. Then let's go on with this. I mean, these bodies, really idealized bodies again. Notice Eve's body now looks a lot like a kind of smaller version of Adam's body. This is a woman who's been hitting the gym. It's a fantastic body, but it's not that kind of body that is associated with feminine ideals at the time. He's just thinking the perfect exemplary body that is in the image of God, is a male body, so I'm going to use it again for this woman. Then you've got some other things, right? He can pose her any way he wants to, so that he tips her over so that you can see more of her butt on purpose. Want to see that? That's really risque at this time. So he's going to show you that. And right next to this dead tree, that's foreshadowing. At this moment of the temptation, now death enters the equation. Before this, there was no indication that they would have died. They would have lived eternally. Now death enters in. And by the way, if you look at the hand, we go back here. Oops. Look at the shape of that. And here that shape is again. That shape of God's hand on Christ. Why is Christ being sent? Because of this moment. There's all of this kind of intertextual relation on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Then we see the serpent again, breasts, no, it's a female, archangel, casting them out. And over here, how have their faces in particular changed? Well, they've gone from being pretty to being ugly. And if you just think in Neoplatonic terms, if beauty means good and true, then obviously ugliness will mean false and evil. And that's what we see over there, including things like this. His hair's all kind of, popping up here. It looks a little bit like horns. Eve's face is even more hideous than his. I'm not going to continue because it's weird enough that I have to talk about like innuendo of oral sex in the other side. But if you take a close look at Adam's genitalia on the other side, you're going to realize something's gone horribly wrong for this guy, and that's another indication that they're in a poor state with God. Now, a lot of people will say, well, why didn't he put in a ton more detail around this? The answer is it's a fresco painting. This is unity. He's just going to focus in on those bodies and the key things in those scenes rather than other things. So again, just quickly through some other things because I just wanted to have you see these up close. As I said, in between the pendentives, there are alternating what are known as sibyls and prophets, and this is one of the sibyls, the Libyan sibyl here. It's just a not Old Testament, but non-biblical prophet who supposedly foretold the coming of Christ. And it's just another way for him to show these glorious bodies, right, and these interesting compositions. Before the Sistine Chapel ceiling was cleaned about 20 years ago, it really looked like this. It's all dirty and sooty, and the way that artists protect paintings is they cover them with layers of varnish. And that works to some degree, but varnish is also semi-porous, and it will just grab all of the material that is floating in the room, such as dust and smoke and soot and so forth, and it gets pretty dirty like this. So I wanted you to see that, and I also wanted you to see this. Who is that? That's David. So the way you can tell it's David is here's the sling. This guy is twice as big as him, and he's cutting off that head. Remember, in the spandrels and in the pendentives, you actually have ancestors of Christ. So this is an ancestor of the family of Joseph, actually. Remember I said that when Michelangelo was tapped to do the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he was already at work on this other commission. And that other commission was the Pope's tomb. This is the tomb of Pope Julius II. It's a second version or so. There are multiple different versions of this. It never got completed. It was a huge project that was going to cost a ton of money, which is probably why the Pope moved Michelangelo off of this to the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He did, however, complete a few of the sculptures that you'll see in a moment here. Moses, for one, and these so-called slaves down at the bottom. But originally, you can see this set up in a pretty predictable form. At the very bottom are slaves. Those are slaves associated with Julius II's reign. He was actually, as we've said before, the warrior pope. He actually took a lot of not slaves, but a lot of captives from, in particular, Muslims. He was in various battles with the Ottomans at this time. And they're also associated with the earthly realm. We all live in the earthly realm, and the idea is we're all trapped in our bodies. We're all slaves to this material existence that we live in. This realm here is kind of like purgatory. It's in between the two realms, associated with Moses over here, and I don't even off the top of my head remember who the female figure is here, with the Pope himself in the center being raised to the level of, in this case, the Virgin Mary and the Christ child by some angels here. So his elevation then, in other words, from the material realm up into heaven. Never got completed. So I'd say it's about 10 years like clockwork. The family of Pope Julius II would try to revitalize this commission. It would start, and then they'd run out of money, or Michelangelo would get called to do something else. And it'd start and stop again. So here's another version of that, same general idea. So then he created these types of sculptures, and the one that is the most finished is the depiction of Moses here. Now, Moses seated is about life size. He's an enormous figure. He comes across with a great deal of monumentality, powerful, powerful figure, right? And what do we know about Moses? What is he famous for? Those of you who took your Sunday school classes? What's that? Yell it out. Parting the Red Sea. Yeah, that's kind of cool. What else?
10 Commandments.
10 Commandments. Very good. So he's one of the original patriarchs. Leads the Israelites out of their own slavery in Egypt, right? Parts of the Red Sea. But the big one, and the one that is emphasized here, is that he's given the 10 Commandments, or the tablets of the law, as they're known. And these are kind of the originary, these are the big things, supposedly, that, again, it starts with Judaism, but the Christians believe are true. It's the thou shalt not kill and all of those types of things. And those are right here. They're inscribed on tablets, right? Under his arm, lets you know who he is. Big, gigantic figure, looking pretty buff, looking pretty strong. I don't know how old he's supposed to be with this beard, but very, very old and still looks crazy strong. Why? Why does he look so buff? Why does that body look the way that it does? Help me out. I hope you know this.
It's the ideal body.
And the ideal body makes him like God, right? So why is God talking to him in the first place? Well, he's godlike. How do I indicate that to someone? I make a perfect proportional body, which means this incredible idealized, physical body here. And then this, the two horns on his head is actually one of those mistranslations again. When the Bible was multiply translated from versions of Hebrew into Greek and then over into Latin, one of the mistranslations for years was the word for rays, which is the original Hebrew, was mistranslated as horns somewhere along the way. And so Moses over and over again got represented with horns, particularly by Christians, by the way, not by Jews. And even though Michelangelo knows better at this point, because the iconography is so well established, he decides to use it again. Like, okay, I know it's supposed to be raised, but Moses has been shown historically with these horns. It's a way for Christians, by the way, to emphasize the primacy of the New Testament over the Old Testament. So he does this. And then if we get up close here, he also uses another kind of standard medieval device. These wide open eyes, slightly bigger proportionately than they probably should be, is something that is oftentimes used in Byzantine icons when someone has witnessed God firsthand, which it's said that Moses did in the form of the burning bush and so forth. And all that incredible detail, right? I just want to emphasize over and over again, this starts as just a big rock, right? A big rock that he goes out to the marble quarries in Carrara, where the Romans had first quarried marble. He picks out his stone and then he carves it into this shape. So these are some of the slaves, yeah.
Can you repeat what the wide open eyes?
So wide open eyes in medieval art, like old Byzantine icons, oftentimes will be an indicator that either you're looking at God, so Jesus oftentimes has huge eyes, or that the figure that you're looking at has witnessed God firsthand. So I don't know how many of you took 202, but if you ever saw San Vitale and you see Theodore and Justinian and they have those gigantic eyes, that's pretty common to say, oh, they've somehow witnessed the presence of God. So the slaves, like many of these works of art, are unfinished, but it gives you a pretty good idea of how the process works, that you kind of carve away layers of material, as he said, to get to that ideal image that God's already put into the universe. And so when you see this really rough work there, that's the first passes with a marble chisel. It's basically almost serrated with teeth on it that you use to carve away big chunks. Then you go to finer and finer chisels, then a lot of sandpaper or abrasives to get to that perfect sheen. This, where these figures are still locked in the stone, because he didn't finish these, they were around, and later artists, in particular people like Bernini, who you'll see when we get to the Baroque period, will look at this and be like, that's really cool. I'm just going to do that and, for my own work. They represent, as I said before, the captives that were taken by Pope Julius II, but they also represent the idea, supposedly, that we're all trapped in our own material bodies. Right now, in our own phenomenal realm, we're trapped in this world, ruled by our senses, and eventually our soul will break free of this, and if we're lucky, or rather if we're good Christians, that soul will be released into freedom in heaven. So they're trapped in these bodies, very, very sensual, and as people have pointed out over and over again, that's one of those ideal bodies, but it's a very, very sensual-looking body, don't you think? I mean, this is a body that's kind of touching himself. It looks a little bit, again, like those Calvin Klein ads that are all over the place. It looks kind of sexualized like the nudie figures were as well, which has led a lot of people to question just like what component or what part might homoeroticism play in Michelangelo's career. And I want to re-emphasize this, that as far as anyone's ever going to be able to determine, we don't know what Michelangelo did in his own private life. No, he was never married. He didn't have any romantic entanglements that we're aware of. When he writes poetry, much of that poetry is devoted to beautiful young men, in particular Tommaso de Cavalieri, who was the most beautiful man in Florence at the time. He clearly loved looking at male bodies, but whether he did anything else is anyone's, speculation. We just don't know. The reason I bring this up, though, is to say a couple of things that seems less important these days, I hope, than it once was when I first started teaching, and that's that some of the people that were the most important contributors to the world over the ages, of course, have not been heterosexual. They've been gay. And just acknowledging that so as to get rid of some of our still persistent homophobia seems important to me. It's more important to me, though, to ask this question. When you can't answer it, it gets tricky, which is, what bearing does that have on the works that they produced? Like, if we actually absolutely knew that Michelangelo was a gay man, does it matter when we look at their works of art? Is there something we see in those works of art that reflect that or important in that way? And if they're not there, I tend to be like, well, why bring it up then, except to say, here's this guy that I bet you all of you are like, this guy's amazing, and he's also gay. So that if you're like, I'm still a little prejudiced, you have to kind of factor those things together. In this case, we don't know. But when it comes to a work like this, maybe it's all just pure Neoplatonism. That's that perfect body. But maybe also, in addition to that, there's something here that's supposed to appeal to dudes. And I say that because they are not thinking about appealing to you ladies. They're not like, I'm going to paint a really hot guy, or I'm going to create a really hot sculpture for the women out there in the world. I'm sorry, they just really don't care so much about your desires. So if there is any desire in here, it's for guys. Another sculptural commission, a tomb or a funerary monument that he didn't quite create, is this one. This is the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici. Famous de' Medici family created a couple of tombs for them. And this is one that, again, this part's finished. He, by the way, composed everything in here, so all these architectural kind of backgrounds to it. This is called the sarcophagus, basically an above-ground funerary casket, usually created out of stone. It's called a sarcophagus here, on which rest a couple of symbolic figures or personifications. This one over here is night, and this is day, and that's the kind of perfected form of Giuliano up above. Where it's not finished is that neither of these sculptures is complete, and originally there were supposed to be river gods down here below them, which would have made this look much less awkward. They're just kind of jutting off into space. And again, the idea was the same as the last one we saw. The river gods were supposed to represent kind of the primordial soup from which we all come before we're born into the world. This is our time, night and day, during the material realm, and then the soul of Giuliano is represented in its perfect, most idealized form up above. And believe me, it's easy enough. I should have brought in a painting, but we have paintings, portraits of Giuliano, and he didn't look anything like this. He was a fairly small guy, kind of, homely looking at best, and here he is, this kind of Greek god. So let's get in there close on him. Right? You should look at some paintings of him. He's just kind of a regular dude in real life. Here he's just phenomenal. That's the ideal state of his soul. Why is he all buff and perfect like this? Because he's in God's image. Because he's up there in heaven. He must have been good and true. You represent him beautifully. That idea should be very clear to everyone. When you look at things like this and you're like, wait a minute, what is he actually wearing? Just stop asking that question. You'll never get a good answer. It could be armor that looks exactly like a male torso. It could be some kind of shoulder pads that are supposed to go over it. Doesn't matter. It's not supposed to make rational sense here. It's supposed to give Michelangelo a way to represent that perfect nude body without necessarily making him nude. He represents here the active Christian life, meaning he is represented kind of like a soldier. Then you go down to this figure. This is night, right? We all live in the times of night and day, the passing of days and so forth. You can tell that that's a representation of night because of the symbols that she has with her. The tiara in her hair has a star and a crescent moon on it, so that's night. Then you go down here and you see an owl. Owls are symbols because they're nocturnal birds of night. And next to this, a bundle of poppies, and poppies are used to put people to sleep, so another symbol of night. Now, if you look at this body, once again, most of it looks, I don't know, like either a fairly robust woman's body or maybe a man's body. And then you look at the breasts there, and I'm sure most of you are like, what the hell's going on with that, right? And the reason I say that is that, you know, with a lot of male artists, especially heterosexual male artists, you're going to see like the world's most fabulous breasts on sculptures. They spend all their time idealizing them. And this doesn't look like that, does it? It kind of looks like he's completed a sculpture and then he just took two things of clay and he's like, I got to make it female, right? Or as one of my students put it, and it didn't get him a great grade on their midterm, it looks like the first really horribly done boob job or something. I was like, no. That's not right. So why? And we don't know. I mean, is it the case that he just wanted this to be a male body and then he had to put breasts on it? They look to me like older breasts, like someone who's been around and had children. Maybe he's trying to get at that idea that this is an older passage of time type of symbol as well. It's a matter of speculation there. And by the way, these types of masks that are on there, that's the mask that we all wear in everyday life, right? That's the meaning this is our facade. The true part of us is our soul, and so you see those represented quite a bit. So then a bunch of things change in the world, right? Over the course of Michelangelo's career, a bunch of key momentous things happen. He lives a very long life by the standards of the day, has a very long career, and he lives during a period where there are momentous changes. So you had a reading by Anthony Blunt, who, by the way, if that name stuck in your brain a little bit, it turns out Anthony Blunt was a devil spy in the end. I know, art historians really aren't that spectacular, but here he is. He was a devil spy who worked for the British for a long time. Then it turned out he was a devil agent for the Russians too, which, how bizarre is that, right? So my question to you is, in that reading, one of the things that I give you that reading for is that it's got a really good discussion of Neoplatonic ideas, and it's got a good discussion of what's happening in the context and how those might have had an impact on Michelangelo's career. And very simplistically, frankly, he splits Michelangelo's career into three parts. He says the beginning part is what you just looked at. All Neoplatonism, beauty in this realm is a reflection of the divine. It's a very robust period for the Catholic Church. Everyone's getting along, very rich and so forth. Then some stuff goes down and it impacts his art, and you get to the second part of Michelangelo's career, in which he's not as trustful of the idea that beauty represents the spiritual. And you see that in works of art like this one, The Last Judgment, on the Sistine Chapel altar wall, which was painted much after the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And then finally you have a third part of his career, the Rondinini Pietà, in which maybe he's gotten rid of the entire idea of a connection between the material realm and beauty and the spiritual realm, and is just working on a spiritual idea. So my question to you is, what are some of the factors that contributed to the change that occurs between early Michelangelo and this work here that doesn't at all look like high Renaissance style? It breaks a whole host of rules. Take just a couple of minutes, turn to your nearest neighbor, and revitalize your memory of that reading and what has happened in the world to affect Michelangelo's style. So again, let's just review what our methodology is here, what our presumptions are in this kind of intro to art history class. We presume that things that happen in the world, especially big things, will have an impact on artists, right? And that what we're looking at this class are the really big things. If you go up in art history, you get down to more nitty-gritty specific factors and so forth. But right here, we've got some really big things that happen at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century that clearly are things we're going to want to look at. So what happens at the end of the 15th century that already starts to kind of get the ball rolling? I mean, some big things, right? 1492, ring a bell to anyone? Right? So, oh my God. The world's not flat, it's actually a sphere. That would be a big thing to have to deal with if you're a Christian. You're saying, well, if God made the world a sphere, how does this even work? Why are we not the center of all things and all of that, right? New information upsets old dogma, always. In the end of the 15th century, by the way, we had the first glimmerings of people really being suspicious of what the Catholic Church is up to when it comes to their embrace of classical philosophy, classical ideas. In particular, they don't like all of the luxury of the Catholic Church, that they're spending so much money on giant monuments, painting, beautiful paintings all over the place, building St. Peter's. But where's that money supposed to go? Well, a lot of people think it's supposed to be going to the poor, that Jesus, after all, was all about a kind of cult of asceticism, meaning you don't really think about spending money on yourself. And here are all these people in the church getting very rich. And one of the most famous of these people speaking out about this is a monk who lived in Florence by the name of Girolamo Savonarola. If you've never heard of this guy before, if you've ever seen a period movie of Florence at this time, he's the guy who basically has never taken a shower in his life, standing on the street corners yelling fire and brimstone to anyone who will listen, and he had a lot of people listening. And he was primarily preaching against the cult of the Medici, the cult of paganism. He didn't like their embrace of classicism. He didn't like their embrace of classical sculptures. He thought that they were all about money, which, to some degree, is not quite entirely wrong. And Michelangelo witnessed this. It had an impact on him later on. In the beginning of the 16th century, we have a whole host of things that eventually result in the Protestant Reformation. 1517, Martin Luther goes to Wittenberg Cathedral, nails his theses to the wall, critiquing the Catholic practice of indulgences in particular. Indulgences. And this practice was one in which Catholics basically kind of created this scenario in which they said that people die, and then before the Last Judgment, before they're determined to go up to heaven or down to hell, most of them exist in a state of limbo, or their souls reside in an area known as purgatory. Right? In between. If you're horrible, you go straight to hell. If you're great, you go straight up to heaven. But most of you are just going to kind of, hang out in purgatory. The practice of indulgences was the granting of kind of like good marks in your favor, or rather your relatives' favor, for either good deeds, for contributing monies or architecture or paintings to the Catholic Church. In other words, it was a kind of pay for pray situation. Catholic Church actually said that if you did these good things, if you went on a pilgrimage, if you built a church, if you commissioned paintings, they would grant you indulgences. These are little, again, gold stars next to your name if you're in purgatory, so that when the final judgment comes around, things are stacked in your favor. Now, the problem with this, besides the fact that it's obviously incredibly crass, right? It's fraught with all kinds of areas that it would be fraudulent, is that it doesn't line up with Christian dogma. Christian dogma says, who has the power to determine whether you go to heaven? Who? only God, no one else. So this idea that the Pope has a pocket full of grace that he can pass around is BS. And that's primarily what Martin Luther said. According to theological precepts, this is ridiculous, and it's just part of the way that the Catholic Church represents or shows that it is all about money. And he gets a huge following, of course. By the way, Martin Luther tried his best to reform the church. Many people did. He didn't succeed. The ideas that Martin Luther is talking about, he had been talking about for at least 15 years before he nails the theses. So he's going on and on and on, and when he can't get anything changed, he splinters the church. And the areas that are in the north, from what is today modern day, basically Germany all the way up, they're prone to Protestantism. Areas more further south, like Italy and Spain and France, still going to remain primarily Catholic. So that happens. Church splinters, right? Big movement away. 1524, same kind of things going on. 1527, we get the beginning of the Anglican Church in England. 1524, I think, the Spanish king, Charles V, marches into Rome and just on a whim says, I'm taking over Rome. Imprisons the Pope for a year and then lets him go, just to show that he's more powerful than him. Right? Big things going on. Catholic Church not as powerful anymore. Losing, bleeding the faithful, right and left to Protestantism and so forth. 1534, Ignatius Loyola and the Jesuits are formed basically as an order that is meant to protect the Pope in terms of theological arguments. If you're wondering why the order of Jesuits has so much power in so many universities around the world, it's because they started as basically the academic arm of Catholicism, meant to find ways, again, legally by church dogma, in order to promote and protect the Pope against Protestants and other people deemed to be heretics. So big stuff going on. And then in 1545, the so-called Council of Trent begins. This is the beginning of what's known as the Counter-Reformation, in which the Catholic Church gets together and says, hey, this is how we're going to deal with those Protestants. And by the way, it gets very, very fanatic right off the bat in 1545. Michelangelo is a moderate. He wants to reform the church. He knows it has problems, but he's not a fanatic. He's not a hardliner. He doesn't want to go kill all the Protestants or something. He thinks they have some things to say. And when he is commissioned to do this work, the Last Judgment scene, it's during a time period in which the Catholic Church has an agenda. It wants to scare the crap out of people. It wants people to be fearful about the second coming, because that way they'll toe the line. That way they'll follow along with church dogma. So when he creates this, there are a whole host of things that don't look particularly like what you see on the ceiling anymore, do they? Some things have shifted. So let me know, just looking at this, spend again one more minute, turn to your neighbors, just look at this. How could you tell if I said, hey, point out some visual things that have changed between this and the Sistine Chapel ceiling that would indicate to you something has changed in Michelangelo's career that we might be able to trace to all of these momentous changes in the context? What would those visuals be? Turn to your neighbors and share your thoughts. So let's start with this. Rationality, clarity, order are key in the high Renaissance style, right? We've established that. They're all about creating the ideal. Does this seem very rational, clear, or ordered to you? Not in the same predictable way, huh? So if I were to say to you, where is this taking place? You got an answer for me? Where are they standing? Why do they exist in that space? These are things that other Renaissance artists during the High Renaissance would have had answers to. You would have been like, oh, he's standing on this. He's there. This is what's happening. This is where the light source is coming from. Predictably, the compositional format would have been something like a giant pyramid or a triangle or horizontals and verticals. And here we just have this kind of swirling chaos. And it's not entire chaos, right? It's ordered, but in a much more energetic way. So we have this grouping around Jesus up here. We're up here in heaven, so we do have something. And then we have something that's an in-between realm, maybe limbo. And then we have the dead being taken out of the earth over here or being ferried over into hell over there. But minor organization by other standards, and certainly full of a lot of movement. Then you look at these bodies. Are those the same youthful, beautiful bodies that you see all over the Sistine Chapel ceiling? No, they're still idealized. And I can't help but think, these are older bodies, right? This is the body of a guy who maybe in his youth looked like Michelangelo's David, and now he's 45 and still hitting the weights all the time. It looks a little bit like one of those Russian wrestlers who's just a big, square, powerful figure, but it's a different kind of idealized body, all about power, all about strength, not so much about physical beauty. I mean, these are guys you don't mess with. Then you go to this. I said that rationality, of course, shows up in the lack of emotion in most of the other works. You can't tell whether they're happy, sad, or what's going on. But what's the presiding emotion you get from this one? Frustration, I heard. Anxiety. How many people get a little bit of fear in there? I mean, remember, look at these guys like shying away from him. Whoa, right? That's Jesus in the center in a glowing nimbus of light, not rational. That's old medieval mandorla. That's a body halo, basically. And everyone around him, by the way, are all the elect. They're already in heaven. These are all saints. And they're still like, holy crap, what's going on? He's pissed off this time, right? I don't know what he's going to do. I mean, St. Peter over here has the keys, and yet he even looks like, How about Jesus' size? How big is he compared to the rest? Huge. This is called hieratic or hierarchical scale. Something used in old medieval works of art, and frankly all the way back to basically prehistoric art times. If something's more important, you make them bigger. But then you get to the Renaissance and they say, don't do that, that's irrational. Keep them all the same size. Make them more beautiful, or put them in light or something like that. So he's made bigger. Again, if he stands up, he's twice as big as most of these figures. And then the spatial recession back here, how far back would they have to be that small? That doesn't make any sense either. So why is he doing this? And there's much more movement in this. Because he wants you to be afraid. He wants all of those church fathers who are going to the Sistine Chapel to start towing the line, to go along with whatever the Pope says. He doesn't want, again, it's not Michelangelo making this determination, it's the Pope of the time, and it's his nearest cardinal saying, we want everyone to be fearful about their status in heaven. We want them to be fearful that if we say you're excommunicated, they'll take that seriously, and they won't go to heaven. Right, so who are some of these characters? There is iconography with it. Over here, if you see keys, you're always going to think St. Peter. Remember, he's always a little bit older. How about this guy here? And the key is, and by the way, Michelangelo didn't paint this on. They hired a guy afterwards who was known as the coverer, was his name, to paint little things to cover the nudity, because that was seen as like, we're not going to do nudity anymore. It's been questioned by Protestants. But this guy, if you can't tell, he's got like some kind of hair G-string on. It's all the rage, guys. It's almost swimsuit season, in case you're looking. Who would that be? No. Who's got hair? Who's got lots of hair and wearing fur? John the Baptist. Very good. So John the Baptist. Then over here with his ladder, that's Jacob with Jacob's ladder. And over here, a guy that was martyred, meaning died for his cause, by being flayed alive, skinned alive. That's St. Bartholomew. And you need to remember this guy because that's a self-portrait of Michelangelo, or likely, on his flayed skin. And as your reading points out, this may be symbolic of the idea that Michelangelo is getting away from the notion that beauty is a reflection of the divine here. Beauty, literally, here is only skin deep, right? I mean, everyone to me looks anxious. Everyone kind of recoiling. Everyone worried. And he wants to have that worry, passed on to people who might not be towing the line. You go down to the realm of the dead, which is the closest thing to you, and I should say this as well. Usually, the altar wall of a church is all happy things. It's like presentation scenes, Jesus being presented as a child. And here your altar wall is a scene that's usually reserved for the exit wall, which is Last Judgment. They don't live in an age of horror movies, so when you see the dead coming out of the earth, this is really fearful to them. Or being ferried over into hell. This is Charon, the ferryman of hell in Greek mythology, being used again here to take all these figures over into hell. And as you can see, he's not like the world's nicest taxi guy. He's beating the crap out of them. Then they go over here, and various horrible things happen to them by all these demonic creatures. This is a man, you don't need to remember his name, who basically criticized Michelangelo, who's one of the clergy, criticized him for painting all the nudity on this, and Michelangelo decided to paint him as King Midas in hell with a snake doing kind of unmentionable things to him again for all eternity. So, in other words, don't piss off artists. And this is the doomed halfway between both, sitting right in the center, right? Did things wrong during his life, now he's been grabbed by, this demonic snake thing, dragged back down into hell. Everything about this is supposed to create anxiety. It's not those pretty, beautiful pictures that we got, in earlier Michelangelo work. Even when something's horrible, it still seems really beauty and pleasant because we're showing you God in the world. Something else is going on here. And it shows up in his sculptures too. This is another Pietà. It's called the Florence Pietà, part of his second stage, if we're to follow Sir Anthony Blunt's kind of staging of Michelangelo's career. And in this case, on the one hand, some things are pretty typically classical. We still have a giant pyramidal form, don't we? When you build this up, it's a pyramidal form. Jesus is in the center. This is the Virgin Mary on this side, and this is one of the other Marys who was at, maybe Mary Magdalene, but not quite clear, that was at the crucifixion. And then up above is Nicodemus. And Nicodemus, unfortunately, is a name you'll have to remember because he's in a lot of these crucifixion or Pietà or lamentation scenes. He's, again, he's referenced as being there in the Bible, so he'll show up a lot if you need another character. In this case, he creates a male character that can kind of finish the pyramid and hold it stably together. His features are probably Michelangelo's features. So you've got a self-portrait of Michelangelo, which becomes fairly common at this time for artists to include themselves in these scenes. But what's not classical about this is Jesus' body, right? Jesus' body still fairly idealized, but it's broken. The angles that he sets up in this body are all diagonals, running this way and that, right? Much more energetic and much more chaotic, right? It's chaos within this pyramidal form. A lot of little jagged lines in the abdomen here, and in the way that the light dances off the way he's cut the sculpture up here. And those little staccato lines running diagonally will create movement in a work of art. And in general, when you have more movement in a work of art, more diagonals, more little staccato things like light dancing off the surface, that creates more energy, and more energy is usually associated with more anxiety or more things that are about to play with your emotions rather than the stability of a simple pyramidal form. Yes?
How do you spell the guy up there? Nicodemus?
Nicodemus. Again, a lot of these terms are on your handouts, but it's Nicodemus. The other thing you can't help but notice is this head tips over at a very severe angle and it touches Mary's face, right? It emphasizes the idea of emotionality. It really pushes the sense of a human connection here, whereas in the original one, if you remember this, right, it's almost detached. Not quite that same picture at all. Now, the final work that he did, and the only work that Blunt is able to point to this last third stage of Michelangelo's career, is the Rondinini Pietà. This is what he was working on at his death. It's a work that originally was much bigger, but then in the last couple of months before his death, so this was originally part of the arm, clearly Michelangelo went back to it and started carving it more narrow, elongating the form and so forth. So if you read through that article and you're like, I don't know what he's talking about in this third stage of his career, I'm a little bit with you, right? I think what he's trying to get at is, if you can imagine this work being finished, and now Jesus in a Pietà figure is this incredibly elongated form that's almost immaterial, almost like a ghost figure, then could that be understood as Michelangelo moving completely away from the idea that anything in the material realm is spiritual, and to a realm where he's just representing the spirit in a way, the spirit essence of Christ, something that doesn't look like a real body, isn't about ideals anymore. And that's what Blunt's trying to get to. Again, it's not particularly convincing to a lot of people because you only really have one example. You have no idea what he was doing with this work. It's even possible that, in his 80s, he was just going along and was like, it's a tough day, and broke an arm off. I mean, who the hell knows? In any case, not much to base an entire argument on. But it's very clear that over the course of this incredibly long career, things have changed, right? Where he started is not where he ends. And one of the reasons those changes occur is we have a huge series of changes in the context and what's affecting him. Any questions on Michelangelo? Okay.